I'm a self-proclaimed From Software fan, and I take this title very seriously. On a fateful night back in 2024, I made a promise to myself that I would play all the Souls games one by one so that I may experience the majesty of the entire Souls universe. Dark Souls 1 and 3 were shining examples of fantastical world building, narrative combat, and overall cohesive storytelling. But when it comes down to Dark Souls 2, I had a lot of hesitations. From where I started, Dark Souls 2 seems to be the most controversial. There's something about the game that resembles a magnetic field. It hypnotizes people who love it, inducing a near psychosis level of obsession and worship on the internet. On the other hand, people who don't love it seem to hate it with their entire being, calling the game bad or the dev team to be the B team of FromSoft, implying that the game does not live up to FromSoft standards. And this is only the impression I got from the online discourse. A brief review of the Steam page shows that the game is quote-unquote very positive, which adds even more confusion to the discourse. On top of the good versus bad debate, there's a subsect of the debate surrounding the original Dark Souls 2 versus Scholar of the First Sin edition. The extent of this polarization seems to go way beyond online discourse. Among few of my friends I've spoken to, some call it a nostalgia bait, while others who haven't even played the game say that they feel obligated to hate it. To be honest, I was hesitant to play the game because I was afraid. To me, discussions around Dark Souls 2 feel like a landmine in a war zone, and to play the game and even have an opinion about it risk me getting caught in the crossfire. But to not play this controversial yet influential game would be me failing the promise to myself, so I decided to face the music and tackle this game once and for all. But little did I know, what started as a dreadful obligation verging on an attempt at disaster tourism turned into an actually long and remarkable adventure that fundamentally changed my perspective on Souls games. To accurately convey to you the depth of the impact this game has on me, I have to take you along this journey, show you the parts that entertained me, the parts that frustrated me, and finally, the parts that truly transformed my view on Souls games. I will break down my encounters throughout the game, noting design choices and gameplay experiences that contributed to my overall understanding of the game. I also looked up information on illusory walls, where to find keys to certain locations, and just general directions whenever I would feel stuck. Before we start, I'd like to sincerely thank all my patrons on Patreon as well as my Discord community members. Without you guys, I would have given up many times over. It takes a lot of effort and time to make the videos that I love that I hope that you guys would love too. And a lot of the times, I can't lie, I just get in my own head. So thank you guys for always being there to ground me, inspire me. And to anyone who'd like to support me and this channel, if you like what you see here today, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and check out the links to Patreon and Discord in the description box down below. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So, a little disclaimer here. If you find my speech and tone a little bit odd at times in the first 25 minutes, just know that I recorded them when I was tipsy. I realize I'm not beating the AI allegations here. English is not my first language, and I just found out that apparently I have a heavier accent when I'm tipsy. So bear with me for just a little bit, I promise it gets better. Now, let's start at the very beginning. From the get-go, Dark Souls 2 feels different than the other games. Instead of an exposition on the world setting and my end objective, the opening cutscene paints a dreamlike and mysterious atmosphere. An old woman with 3 teeth speaks ominously about my cursed condition. Apparently, I am slowly losing my grasp on reality, forgetting my loved ones and even my own name and purpose. She points out that there is a kingdom far to the north called Drangleic, and that the souls would mend my ailing mind. She prophesies that I will be there one day, and so off my character go, riding a boat and jumping into a dark hole, falling through space-time. Then I wake up in a pavilion in a place called the Things Betwixt. I was genuinely a little confused at the start. There was no character selection at the start of the game. In fact, my character is a male model that seems to have no weapons and is just wearing a generic cape. As far as I could see, there was no clear path on exactly where to go after I spawned, so I ran along the edges and accidentally fell to my first death. This was a great start. Eventually, I found the glowing hut in the distance and entered the shack. A couple of old ladies couldn't wait to tell me that I have the face of the curse. They proceeded to ask me about my origins, which is basically the traditional character creation through an interactive dialogue. I don't really have a strong preference in classes, so I decided to roll the dice and try out a strength-faith build this time. I have to say, this entire interaction felt forced to me. In other Souls games, player agency is granted from the moment I spawn. I get to choose which class I want to play, name my character, and customize it to my liking. But here, the creation is integrated into the dialogue, which does go well with the general flow of the game and lore, as I'm supposed to have a fading mind and therefore need to recall my name and origins, so to speak. The ladies kept reinforcing the notion that my journey would be extremely difficult, and that I would quote-unquote lose my souls, all of them, over and over again. This part in particular felt rather immersion-breaking. Souls games are known as hard games, but the difficulty is often the byproduct of the gameplay and narrative, not the main goal. Players experience different levels of difficulty based on their builds and skill level, so there really isn't an intended difficulty. In Dark Souls 2, however, it felt like it was the developers warning me about the experience I was about to have, and not an organic element of the gameplay itself. The game felt too self-aware and rubbed its difficulty in my face. Regardless, I found out that the old ladies were actually past firekeepers. I looted the shack, found a few key items. Then I walked out of the hut, eventually lighting my first bonfire. The following section was the actual tutorial. Here, aside from the usual press R1 to attack, Dark Souls 2 introduces a unique torch mechanic. Instead of a torch that is automatically lit as a weapon or an item, here I have to actually interact with the bonfire, toggle to the prompt light torch, then hold the torch until the next available lamppost to interact with. The torch has a timer that starts ticking the moment I light it and runs out if the timer hits 0. I knew then that there were probably going to be quite a few sections of the game that would rely on this mechanic. I then lit a few podiums along the path, encountered a stone statue that blocked my way, then died by randomly falling into a pit. Classic. I walked aimlessly in a maze-like tunnel, then I turned a corner and suddenly light poured in. Nothing could have prepared me for seeing Majula for the first time. The warming sun, the glistening water, and the sound of melancholic bells pulled me in with every step I took. The edition I played, The Scholar of the First Sin, came out in 2015. Yet, for a game that is a decade old, the graphics are still very pleasing to the eye. There's a unique, granular, textured design to the environment that cultivates that otherworldliness of Majula. I felt safe and serene, like I was resting in a quiet small town on my way to face the rest of the chaotic world. I could just sit a while by the bonfire and watch the water flow. But I had a task to rid myself of my curse. I went to speak to the lady in the green cape known as the Emerald Herald. She's the classic level-up lady in these games. Her first line of dialogue was very intriguing. "Are you the next monarch?" This line raised many questions for me. Why did the Emerald Herald assume that the person coming up to her would be the next monarch? What happened to the current one? I thought I came here to this land to cure my disease, and how does that have anything to do with becoming a monarch? The Emerald Herald continues to speak in vague terms, suggesting that I seek the 4 great souls who will serve as the beacon to my journey to face King Vendrick. This became my first goal of the game. I spent the next 10 minutes or so familiarizing myself with Majula, speaking to a few NPCs I found, and looked into a few diverging paths that led to game progression. I spoke about this briefly in my Dark Souls video, but I generally have a hard time with open-ended beginnings to a game. I struggled to find a path in Dark Souls 1, and I struggled even more here. There were no immediate mobs that I could test my strength on each path, so I kind of had to just pick one and commit to it, with a very large potential risk that I might have picked a difficult late game area to start with. Eventually, I decided that the arched hallway next to the bonfire might be the game's way of telling me where to go first, because why else would you need a torch in broad daylight next to a path? Past the arched hallway, following the creek that ran quietly through a cave, I arrived at the Forest of the Fallen Giants. Here, an ogre tread through the creek mindlessly, and hollowed soldiers limped along the grassy path. It was a scene from a fairy tale land. As I moved along the grassy path, I got to really feel out the combat and movement mechanics on the soldier enemies here. One characteristic stood out to me in particular: weapon movement. As part of the cleric class's starting weapon, I had a mace equipped. When I hit enemies with it, I could really feel the weight of the weapon expressed through this turn of the wrist from my character model. Take a look here. Now, I've never held a mace in real life, but I would imagine it quite heavy at the top of the weapon, just as it was depicted in DS2. But despite this weighty feel to be realistic, when it's translated into gameplay, there was a sense of sluggishness that frustrated me. It always felt like there was a delay between my R1 input and the actual swing. The good thing is, though, that once I accepted that there was this delay in response, it was predictable and easy to adjust to. I followed the trail of enemies, eventually arriving at my first bonfire in this area. Right next to the bonfire, I met my first NPC merchant, Hag Melintia. I quickly scanned through her inventory, and one item caught my eye: life gems. When consumed, they heal a small portion of my health bar over a period of time. In addition to the traditional healing item Estus flasks that get refilled every time I rest at a bonfire, I now have an additional source of healing consumable. I can buy as many as I can afford from merchants that sell them and can carry a large number of them at a time. This might seem like a small addition to the healing system, but I think it fundamentally changes my mentality when playing the game. On the positive side, this mechanic encourages me to fully embrace exploration and enemy encounters. I no longer feel the desperation to run to the next bonfire because I worry about running out of heals and having to run back after death. It lowers the stakes of each encounter and makes me feel more at ease straying off the main path and exploring every corner of the map. The downside, however, also lies in this ease. My lack of fear for my environment is an anomaly in Souls games. In Dark Souls 1 and 3, I feel a constant tension from my environment. Every encounter has a cost, as every bit of damage and healing you use takes away from a potential future encounter. Every step I take has to be calculated, and as a result, this underlying tension becomes part of that signature difficulty that Souls games are known for. Dark Souls 2, however, while still retaining combat difficulty, drastically reduces the tension by basically giving you infinite healing. If I have a hard time with a particular encounter, I can always retreat, heal up, fight, and rinse and repeat this cycle with no real risk. I personally do like this mechanic, as exploration is one of the main features that draws me in from these games, but I can easily imagine how this feature alone removes that Souls-like feel for a lot of people. Right next to the bonfire, there was a ladder leading down to a hole. My curiosity took over, and I just needed to know what was in said hole. I climbed the ladder all the way down and ended up in a fire pit-like environment. So far in this game, one predominant feature I noticed was this vague sense of open world-like environment. At every juncture, there were multiple choices. Dark Souls 1 was interconnected, sure, but once you picked a path, there was usually a very clear direction on where the game intended for you to go. Here, I had to pause every time I climbed the ladder, arrived at a new space, or turned a corner. You can see from my gameplay just how much time I spent moving my camera around to take in my environment. I think a huge factor of my general disorientation came from the flat visual texture of DS2. If you look at DS1 and DS3, even though they have different color palettes and stylistic differences, there's a distinct separation between the character model and the environment. The ability to distinguish foreground and background is crucial for swift decision-making when navigating the terrain. In Dark Souls 2, however, I often found myself confused about where my character model was in relation to a surface. It was hard to gauge whether or not I could make a jump, whether or not I would fall off an edge, or whether or not a space I saw was a tangible space I could actually arrive at and not be hindered by an invisible wall. With a bit of time, however, I noticed that the game does try to help out in certain ways, such as indicating traversable paths by placing loot drops along the way. Once I see the cues enough times, it becomes pretty consistent to spot them in the environment. I think this area was the true tutorial of DS2. The intricacies lay in its vertical layout and introductions to new types of consumables rather than enemy combat design alone. I toured the external wooden scaffolding part, making my way up and down the platforms, mostly navigating by following new loot drops. In one of these encounters with a few hollowed soldiers, I accidentally fell to my death. Here, I want to mention another unique DS2 mechanic, hollowing. In Dark Souls 2, every time you die and respawn, your health bar shrinks a little, until it hits the cap at 50%. Similar to Dark Souls 1, this process is also called hollowing, and can be reversed with the item Human Effigy, analogous to the humanities in DS1. It's hard for me to decide how I feel about this mechanic. Dying and losing souls is already a punishment to making mistakes, so losing max health on top of it felt uncalled for. But then again, having limited human effigies and deciding when to use them throws an interesting decision-making process in the mix of gameplay. Continuing on, I followed tree branches and loot drops, climbing up and down the ladders. Honestly, I was so lost in just simply following my instincts. Thanks to well-placed enemies and context clues, I arrived at a platform with fire pot throwing enemies and a bunch of oil barrels leaning against a wall. Upon close examination, there was a crack alongside the wall. It became clear to me instantly that if the barrels met with fire, they would probably blow open the wall. Unfortunately, I had killed the fire pot throwing enemy too fast, and he wasn't able to be lured into throwing a pot on the barrels. I had to improvise a little by hitting the barrels with a fire sword I had picked up earlier. Just when I was patting myself on the shoulder for being smart, I blew open the wall and myself as well in the process. Fortunately, in the few frames of my death screen, I realized that I had unknowingly unlocked a shortcut back to the bonfire. Oh, how that beautiful sense of Soulsborne comfort is back. The door, in fact, does open from this side. I don't know if it's the area's monotonous textures or the overwhelming amounts of platforming and ladder climbing. I was feeling extremely lost and disoriented for most of my time here. Eventually, somehow, I took an elevator down and found myself in the boss fog. I entered the boss fog and a cutscene appeared. My arrival had seemingly awoken a slumbering giant. He growled like a wild animal, breaking free of his shackles and lunged towards me. This was a very familiar golem-style fight that I had done so many times throughout all of the FromSoft games. There was nothing special to the tactics I employed, which was basically to chop at his ankles while being conservative with my stamina. His moves were extremely simple as well. The real difficulty for me lay in the fact that he was the same color as the background. again with the graphics issue I mentioned. This made it difficult for me to accurately position myself. At times, it felt like I was hallucinating his hitboxes. Despite my visual difficulties, the actual boss moves were easy to deal with. Without too much trouble, I had chopped his ankles to death. The boss music abruptly stopped, and I was awarded with the Soul of the Last Giant and the Soldier Key. For the first boss fight of the game, I was a little shocked by how anticlimactic the fight was. I walked around the boss arena for a while, eventually realizing that there was nowhere to go after, so I used the homeward bone and went back to Majula. So there's actually another really important aspect of Dark Souls 2 that I have to talk about. I couldn't find anywhere else in the script to put it, so I'm just going to talk about this here to give you a brief understanding of the mechanic. Among one of the many stats I can level up in DS2, vigor, endurance, etc., there's a brand new stat that is unique to DS2, the ADP, or Adaptability stat. I say that I have to talk about this because it is a crucial cornerstone to my experience of DS2. On the surface, the ADP stat controls agility, which can be broadly understood as how fast your character does a thing, such as drinking Estus flasks or using consumables. Most importantly, your ADP stat directly controls how many iframes you get. When the entire Souls combat system relies heavily on dodge roll invincibility frames, how many of those you get dictate how much room you have for mistakes. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to the detailed number of how many iframes each ADP stat grants you, but let's just say that the starting iframes I had with the cleric class did not feel nearly enough. Many times at the beginning of the game, I would dodge roll and still get hit, even though in any other Souls games it didn't affect me. As annoying as it was when that happened, I also looked at it from another perspective. If I can have too few iframes, the inverse is also true. I can have too many iframes, so to speak. Ultimately, my room for mistakes is determined by me. Once I realized this, I prioritized leveling up my ADP alongside my basic defensive stats such as vigor and endurance. I think this decision really helped me have a smoother early game experience. Okay, now that we have this out of the way, let's continue on. It took me quite a while to decide on where to go next. I wandered around in Majula, exploring the buildings and their surroundings. There was this giant pit at the center, and there was visible loot on a beam inside. I could tell that I most definitely could not survive the fall, so I decided that I would wait on attempting my path downward. After scouting all corners of Majula, I decided to proceed with the stone hallway at the far end of Majula. I proceeded through the waterways, following the stairs up, eventually arriving at Heide's Tower of Flame. Heide's Tower was astoundingly beautiful. Broken Gothic architecture, larger-than-life giant sentinels, water bluer than the sky. It was clear that the tower I saw was only a remnant of what once was, perhaps a city on water. But even in its decrepit state, the tower remained serene. So far, Dark Souls 2 exceeded my expectations of visual spectacle in every way possible. Compared to the Forest of the Fallen Giants, Heide's Tower was a lot more linear in its progression. I followed the narrow paths to a central hall that diverges into two paths, a left side and a right side. I attempted my way to the left, but a single Heide knight was determined to stop me in my tracks. He had the most unpredictable and aggressive movesets. After one too many deaths to my liking, I decided to retreat and take the right-hand path. I would come back to the left side later. The right-hand side was indeed the path forward. Shortly after I passed the central hall, I arrived at the door of this area's boss, the Dragon Rider. Unfortunately, the Dragon Rider was extremely lackluster compared to the area he was situated in. He was roughly the size of the old knights in this area, wielding a halberd and a shield. His movements were wide and slow, and as a result, he was a poor victim of circle strafing. My movements were way faster compared to him, so once I learned how to stick to his back, I was able to basically whack him to death. I'm not usually one to ask for complex boss designs, as I don't normally judge these boss encounters as standalones. As long as their designs are in line with the area they're situated in and have at least one aspect that is intriguing, such as music, visual, or even gimmicks, I would gladly give it a pass. But Heide's tower is a very short and small area, so I really thought the boss would at least try to compensate by having some kind of beautiful visuals. Alas, I did not get what I wanted, but the fight was short and painless, so I quickly moved on after my victory. I climbed up the stairs from the boss arena, lit the bonfire at the top of the structure, then spoke to an NPC who was kneeling and praying to the distant water. Upon speaking with this NPC, I found out that her name was Lisha. She was the lady who sold miracles and all miracle-related equipment. I did not want to buy any miracles at this moment, so I moved on past her, crossing the bridge to the next area. Something I noticed at this point of the journey was how each area so far had such distinct visual identities. It seemed like there was a theme for each area, and all of the enemy designs, music, and environmental graphics served to provide a look and feel of that theme. Forest being, well, a forest with greeneries and fairy tale beings, and Heide's Tower being a city on water. The funny thing is, as distinct as these areas were, the transitory areas were not at all. The hallway from Majula to the forest, between Majula and Heide's Tower, and now from Heide's Tower onto the next area, all of these pathways are all dark gray stone structures. And to be honest, when I was in one of the transitory places, I would frequently get deja vu and temporarily forget where I was and what I was supposed to be doing. I had a hard time mapping out where these areas were situated in relation to one another. And just as I was thinking this to myself, the bonfire to No Man's Dwarf appeared. Remember the torch mechanic from the tutorial? Well, it turns out I was right. This next area would be where the torch really got to shine. I'm so funny. Ha, sorry. No Man's Dwarf was a port town seemingly run by pirates. When I first approached the town, half of it was dimly lit. There were unlit torch poles everywhere, and it clicked with me immediately that I had to reach these poles and light them in order for the town to be more visible. Interestingly, even though the lack of visibility can be frustrating at times, especially with enemies who loved to ambush me, it was actually really satisfying to see myself lighting up each corner of the area, revealing more details. You also see a really clear visual indicator of where you've been, sort of like a progress bar. Unfortunately, even with a lot of the areas lit up, I still had a really hard time making my way through. The samurai-style pirates were aggressive, and hollows appeared in gang squads, and the dogs, well, dogs were dogs, like every other FromSoft game. Most of my hits missed anyway. Slowly but surely, I scraped every inch of the town. On the second floor of a hut, I found a stylish NPC by the name of Lucatiel. She pledged to help me in my journey in the future and offer me a sense of comfort in such a strange place. As I proceeded to the far end of the town, I encountered an enemy type that came straight out of my nightmare. I had to look up their name because I fled from the dark rooms where they resided so fast I couldn't even get a look at them. Well, their name was exactly what I had seen, or not see, I guess, Dark Dweller. The shape of them vaguely reminded me of the Woolaseel town residents. Do you see it? In any case, both are extremely creepy. This area had one shortcut, and it was unlocked after knocking down a suspension bridge. I reached the far end of the town and pulled a lever. With the sound of bells tolling far off in the distance, a ship with ghost flame lamps sailed to the dock. Aboard this ship was the area boss, the Flexile Sentry, situated right under the main deck. When I entered the fog, the room was already filled with ankle-high water. The Flexile Sentry approached menacingly. It was in the shape of two conjoined warriors, with one side wielding dual scimitars and the other spiked clubs. To come face to face with such a strange creature, I wasn't really sure how to tackle this fight. Very quickly, I learned that his Spike Club side was way easier to deal with, as it was way less erratic and much slower than the Scimitar side. Just when I thought I could get comfortable with the rhythm of fighting, I noticed that the water was rising as the fight went on. What a fascinating mechanic. As the water rose up my torso, it was becoming harder and harder to dodge and move around. It felt as though the walls were closing in on me as I floundered around. After panic rolling and getting caught up in a corner multiple times, I somehow managed to beat it. The water was already halfway up my body when I finally achieved victory. In hindsight, this was most definitely one of my favorite fights of DS2. I went into the room past the boss arena and examined a contraption. A cutscene appeared. The ship's bells tolled again, and it sailed out of the port town. The ship dropped me off at a dark-aged prison-like structure called the Lost Bastille. I still don't really know what to make of this place. Unlike the previous areas, there wasn't really an identifiable visual theme that I could see. A prison? I guess, but it didn't look much different from the various stone structures in the Forest of the Fallen Giants. But I kept an open mind and went on exploring. The Lost Bastille had royal swordsmen, undead jailers, as well as some hollowed soldiers. The entire area was filled with oil barrels and enemies who just loved throwing firebombs that would blow you up in pieces. I navigated past the open courtyard and along the narrow pathway, eventually leading up to a circular tower. Inside, I ran into the NPC Lucatio once again. She told me the tale of the undead and that if the legends were true, one could reverse fate with the souls in this land. I was surprised that she didn't have more to say other than the story I already knew. I walked around the area looking for ways to progress, and on one of my retreads, a mystical fog appeared in the courtyard. A moment later, a floating gray warrior appeared. I could feel the heat of the adrenaline rush when I saw those red glaring eyes. I later found out that his name is the Pursuer, and he in fact pursued me. I was terrified and decided to run for my life. I ran back to the cove where the ladder was, hoping he would stop chasing me and perhaps disappear. And I was right. After a brief moment, he was gone. Along one of the side walls of the narrow passageways, I noticed the same type of cracked wall I saw in the Forest of the Giants. Aha, so this was going to be another shortcut or a checkpoint. I looked around to see if there were any barrels or enemies I could use to blow up the wall, and lo and behold, there was a jailer stationed at the top of the stairs with an oil barrel ready to be deployed. I could see in my mind's eye how you could get the jailer to come down the stairs, triggering the barrel to roll down against the wall, and then somehow get the jailer to throw a fire pot or something, but I didn't want to rely on this whole flimsy setup. So instead, I took care of the jailer separately and kicked the barrel down the stairs myself. I learned my lesson from the last time I tried to blow up a wall with a fire sword, so instead of a kamikaze mission, I used a fire arrow instead, blowing up the wall and revealing the bonfire behind the wall safely. A blacksmith resided in the room behind the bonfire, Macduff. I spoke to him briefly, then went on to explore the rest of the area. I think Lost Bastille was probably the most confusing area for me. At this point, I was genuinely lost as to how I could progress, so I consulted Google. Right here is a great example of that open worldness I talked about at the beginning of the video. It seemed like I had a few options. 1, there was an optional area boss, the Ruined Sentinels, through the door behind the petrified statue I had previously passed by. 2, an optional boss, the Pursuer, that I actually missed in the Forest of the Fallen Giants. 3, I could bypass the entire area boss and whatnot and just proceed to the next area. So I decided on my order of operations. I would first challenge the Pursuer and buy a fragrant branch of yore to unlock the petrified statue, go through the previously blocked door to tackle the area boss, and once I'm caught up with the missing content, I would move on to the next area. I purchased a branch from Merchant Malentia, then went back to the Forest of the Giants to fight the pursuer. Using the soldier key I previously obtained from the tree giant at the beginning of the game, I found the pursuer waiting on a dilapidated rooftop. This was not my first rodeo with him. He appeared just the same as when he was on the hunt for me in Bastille, floating menacingly in mid-air. However, despite his imposing posture, once I studied my fear and paid close attention to his actual moveset, I quickly learned that the pursuer's attacks were highly telegraphed. There was nothing unexpected to account for. I was slightly disappointed, but loved that I could see the glistening water off in the distance while listening to the low drumming of the boss music, so I considered it a meditative boss fight experience. Once the pursuer was defeated, I went through the boss arena to the next empty area. On the left-hand side, on top of the stairs, was a little bird's nest. Ah, I see. A cute little throwback to DS1's crow. I walked up to the nest, and there it was, another crow flying towards me. After a brief journey, the crow dropped me off at a previously inaccessible part of Bastille. I had come full circle. Next up, I was ready to tackle the area boss blocked by the petrified statue. I freed this poor guy with a fragrant branch of yore and he came alive. Well, alive for a second because I had to kill him anyway. What happened next was like a scene straight out of Looney Tunes. I opened the door and dipped my head into the dark room just to see what was going on. Unbeknownst to me, an entire room full of royal swordsmen spotted me. I saw a few of them mobilize, so I retreated out from the structure, hoping to funnel them through the door into a single file line. And sure they did, all 5 identical soldiers came at me at once. Moments like these made me laugh. But you know what else made me laugh? Watch this. If I wasn't so cautious playing these games, I would have just walked off and died to gravity. After I killed the royal swordsmen littered all over the building, I found my way to the area boss, the Ruined Sentinels. The Ruined Sentinels fight is a gank fight in essence, 3 identical warriors in a 2-level boss arena. The only interesting element of the fight might be the fact that the entrance to the arena was this broken ledge on the upper floor. When I entered the boss fog, there was a single Ruined Sentinel. So I had a moment to 1v1 this guy. But after he was defeated, I had to jump down to the main floor of the arena, and that was when the fight got boring for me. 2 bosses charged at me with no consideration of one another, and there was no aggro switch, no choreography. Thank God I summoned an NPC to help me divert some of the aggro, otherwise it was just going to be an unpleasant gank fight. I think the most interesting thing about this boss was actually the boss arena after your victory. At first sight, the arena is an empty rectangular room, but upon closer examination, many of these wall panels were actually illusory walls. I suppose now would be a great time to talk about illusory walls in Dark Souls 2. Normally, in other Souls games, illusory walls can be revealed via rolling into them or using a weapon to hit them. The walls themselves also had visible markers, such as a crooked painting or a unique crack of some sort. I discovered most of them because they were placed in locations where it was feasible for you to roll into or hit by accident, thus finding the secret. The thing with the illusory walls in DS2, however, is that in order to reveal what is behind the wall, you have to press the A or the X button up against the wall depending on which controller you have, and that is the only way. The walls also barely had any markers on them. I mean, I could be blind here, but you can tell me if you see any discernment. I only knew this because I saw a tip while looking up directions earlier, and props to the first players who found these walls organically. Anyways, there were a couple of chests to loot after the boss fight, but it was a dead end in terms of mainline progression. I teleported out of the building and proceeded to look for the actual progression route to the next area. Not long after I walked around the area and scraped every inch of the accessible ground, I found out that the way to progress was actually through the boarded up wall behind where the pursuer spawned. I made my way through the enemies inside, taking this very strange mummy-style elevator, crossing a bridge, eventually arriving at Sinner's Rise. It appeared that Sinner's Rise was this dilapidated tower with a giant elevator in the middle. Taking this elevator all the way down, I stepped out into a sewer system. With the water halfway up my torso, it was hard to maneuver across. Here, I saw another flexile sentry. It was rather off-putting, as the boss fight in No Man's Dwarf was very near and dear to my heart, and in a way, seeing this reuse of the boss as a normal enemy kind of cheapened its significance. I moved along the sewer path, and once I was out of the waist-deep water, I arrived at the fog for this area's boss, the Lost Sinner. This fight had a fascinating gimmick. Outside the arena, there were 2 ascending staircases on either side. At the very top of the stairs were locked rooms. The first time I was here, I didn't bother checking the 2 rooms. Upon my entrance to the boss arena, it was pitch black inside. I could vaguely see a humanoid-sized boss charging at me. When she was close, I was able to lock on and try to fight and dodge like normal. But as soon as she changed directions or even moved slightly off of my line of sight, I would lose my lock-on entirely. I got the sense that it probably wasn't impossible to fight the boss like this, but I was just feeling frustrated that I couldn't see. It was then that I remembered the 2 locked rooms. When I came back for a rematch, I unlocked the 2 rooms with the Bastille key I obtained previously. Inside each room, there was a chute connecting to the boss arena. When I walked near it, there was a prompt popping up saying, "Set light." So this was the solution to a dark boss arena. Once I lit up both chutes, I entered the boss fog once again. This time around, I finally got to get a good look at the Lost Sinner. Her design vaguely reminded me of Artorias. She wore rags all over her body and 2-handed a greatsword. Fighting her was easy now that I could actually see, as her movesets alone were not challenging at all, and it felt like the visibility was a reward for paying attention to my environment. With the Lost Sinner down, I exited her arena. In the middle of the room was a bonfire. Upon lighting it, I realized that this bonfire was apparently a primal bonfire, different from the rest of the normal ones, I suppose. Interacting with it automatically sent me back to the far fire in Majula. So perhaps the Lost Sinner Souls was one of the 4 great souls. Now that I was back at Majula again, it was time to decide on my next destination. Between the Forest of the Giants and the Sinner's Rise, I was starting to sense that there were many dead ends in DS2. In other Souls games, whenever I felt lost or stuck, it was mostly safe to assume I had missed a turn or an item or whatever it was needed to progress, that the disorientation was my fault. But in DS2, it really did look like if you were stuck, it just meant that there literally was nowhere else to go. I had to consult Google as I was standing around in Majula for quite a while. It pointed me back to the hallway where the contraption was. Last time I was here, I accessed No Man's Dwarf, and this time, however, the miracle lady Leisha stood in front of the contraption. She told me that the room we were in led to 2 paths, and the contraption in the middle could be used to reveal the other path. She said it ran on miracles, apparently, and offered to quote-unquote provide me one. Well, sure, why not? And guess what? It cost 2,000 souls. Everything is so expensive. Oh well, price of doing business, I guess. I had no clue why this contraption was even necessary or why it was there, but after Leisha and I said a little prayer, the room spun like a little children's toy. A new path emerged. Following this path to the other side, I emerged into Huntsman's Copse. In essence, Huntsman's Copse is like a forest environment filled with bandits and hunters. They blended into the shrubs, waiting to ambush me. At the center of this area was an open field with seemingly divergent paths. A bridge led to an optional area called the Undead Purgatory, and the other led to the area boss, the Skeleton Lords. Now, I only knew this because I got lost going in circles over and over again until I decided to look up directions. At first, I was trying my hardest not to get spoiled, so I only looked up written instructions. But see, the problem is these instructions were like, go straight, turn right, past the torch hollow, down under a cave, through the bridge, up the slope. My god, there are like 7 torch hollows in a row. Which one are you talking about? Anyways, I gave up on the written instructions altogether and just looked up a video walkthrough. Eventually, I found a ledge that wrapped around the edge of a mountain. At the very end of this path, I obtained a key to unlock the bonfire in this area. And from here, it was a straight shot to the boss, the Skeleton Lords. I can't say I like this boss for any mechanical reasons, but I was certainly entertained by it. When I entered the arena, 3 red skeletons charged at me. I thought this was just going to be a run-of-the-mill 3v1 gank fight. However, once I thought I had killed one of them, the real boss fight started. One singular robed skeleton dissolved into a million smaller ones. The first time this happened, I was turned away for a second, and when I turned around, oh my god, all of a sudden I was getting chased by hordes of skeletons. The arena had a few skeleton piles that served as separators for the space. The real fun was trying to navigate around these obstacles and funnel the skeletons into an order so as not to get overwhelmed. It felt like herding sheep in a way. It was simple fun, and I enjoyed it quite a lot. Once I exited the Skeleton Lord's arena, I pulled a lever that lowered a suspension bridge. Past the bridge and through a cave, I arrived at Harvest Valley. This area was basically Dark Souls 2's Poison Swamp. At this point, I had come to realize that every Souls game had one of these make you slow and fat roll and slowly kill you and hidden enemies gank on you type of areas. However, most of the parts where I actually had to slow walk through poison were limited and optional. It was up to my discretion whether or not I wanted to go through the trouble for a few loot drops. Compared to Blighttown from Dark Souls 1, where the swamp was inevitable, Harvest Valley really wasn't all that bad. From what I could see, Harvest Valley looked like some sort of labor camp and coal mine. Dark magic giants were steered by humanoids, and a bunch of crawlers prowled in the poison mists. Oh, you also do get these pyromancy ladies in black and red outfits. They were deadly, but kind of pretty. Once I made it past the various nooks and crannies and finally found my way inside a building, I started to see tanks and tanks of poison all stacked up in these rooms. The inside of the building technically counts as the next area, Earthern Peak. I was a little surprised that Harvest Valley didn't get its own area boss. Here, I saw a few more enemy types, the most notable being these hammersmiths and the headless mannequins. Their designs were truly on the opposite ends of the spectrum. The hammersmiths were slow and honestly a little dumb. My most often used strat was just to aggro them and let them break through the poison tanks themselves as they were slowly catching up to me. They all got poisoned and died before they could even reach me. The headless mannequins, however, were probably one of the most formidable and annoying foes up to this point in the game. They were fast, erratic, and deadly. I would try to fight back, but most of the time they would dodge my attacks and I would be dead before I even knew it. Many of my victories against them were pure luck, but I guess if you try enough times, statistics are on your side or something like that. Not long after I made it into the building, I came across a boss fog. Inside, a slug-shaped boss floundered around, the covetous demon. This demon had a huge slobbery mouth. He didn't just want to kill me, he wanted to eat me. The design of this boss reminded me of the Gaping Dragon from DS1, both turn into monsters from their gluttony. Mechanically speaking, this fight was extremely frustrating to me. Not only did the demon move very slowly, just like every other DS2 boss, the camera felt unruly for most of it. It was truly the case that I fought the camera more than the boss. The one interesting feature that salvaged my experience was when hollows dropped from the ceiling. I wasn't expecting it when it happened the first time, and reflexively thought that this was going to be a gank fight. But what surprised me was when the covetous demon lost interest in me and turned to swallow the poor hollow. It was at that moment I felt fully immersed in the fight. If you've made it this far into the video, it might sound like I'm complaining a lot about boss fights in the game. I'm only saying this to you now because I don't want you to get the wrong impression. For me, the allure of boss fights can come from many different aspects. In more recent Souls games such as DS3 and Elden Ring, the mechanical satisfaction of figuring out boss movesets, timing my attacks and dodges, and witnessing the beautiful visual effects is the main attraction. However, in older games such as DS1 and DS2, I value the atmosphere and lore-based design of the bosses more. It could be that the older games just didn't have the capability to achieve the fast-pacing combat, or simply that FromSoft designed this slow combat style on purpose, but I thoroughly enjoy and embrace this slow pacing, and in turn pay much more attention to the area leading up to the boss and the detailed design of the boss's behavior. The covetous demon swallowing the hollow alive made me believe that what was in front of me was a hungry monstrosity, and these details entertained me during the otherwise slow combat. So yeah, I complain about the inconveniences during the boss fights from time to time, but I always want to point out the details outside of the mechanical difficulties that made my experiences remarkable. Moving on past the covetous demon, I was still in the same building. I came across a few more headless mannequins and hammersmiths, and eventually some spear-wielding soldiers as well. I followed the trail of enemies until I saw a soldier stationed near a rotating windmill. Coupled with the 2 online messages left on the ground that both mentioned torches, I got the faint idea that this might be an area gimmick. Lo and behold, once I held a torch up to the windmill, there was a prompt, set light. I interacted with it, and well, I wasn't really setting light, but more like setting the whole windmill on fire. The windmill slowed and eventually stopped turning. I didn't see what changed after I had just set the whole thing on fire, and my curiosity was killing me. I looked up online to see what I had just done, and a brief search told me that by lighting the windmill, I had drained the poison out of the boss's arena. Okay, that's nice, doing a favor for my future self. I moved through the rest of the building, trying to find my way. More poison, more traps, more crazy enemies. At the end of my exploration, I came face to face with another boss, Mytha the Baneful Queen. Mytha is a half-human, half-snake being, wielding a long spear. There was something extremely creepy about her holding her own head in one hand. She moved around in an arena that was filled with poison on the outer rim, and I can imagine that if I hadn't lit up the windmill, the whole arena would have probably been a giant poison swamp. A part of me wishes now that I had gone to fight her without the poison drain, just so I could get super frustrated and then figure out the trick of the windmill and feel extremely relieved. Perhaps I would like to feel my victory was achieved through a bit more effort and attention. My little NPC helper Jester Thomas and I beat Mytha very quickly, and I was still left wondering how she was still alive after her head had been severed this whole time. I walked up the stairs from her arena and got in an elevator that went up, and up, and up, and up? Now where was this thing going? Huh? Why am I in a volcanic mansion area? So you mean to tell me that above the skybox of Harvest Valley and open-air space was a suspended mystical dimension that hid away Iron Keep? Okay, bro. The Iron Keep has a very clear visual and identity from the very start. Covered in lava and forged with iron, the area's atmosphere felt oppressive. I could almost feel the heat on my skin through the screen. The one downside to this kind of volcanic area historically was that because the atmosphere was harsh and oppressive and my screen was covered in red at all times, if the traversal was too difficult and too long, then the visual fatigue could be quite annoying over time. I was afraid I was going to get tired of this area very quickly too. I have to admit, I probably died more times in this area than any other previous area. There was something uniquely frustrating about how the alone knights were stationed inside the keep. Their eyes were like lasers spotting me from the other side of the facility, and while I was on the run from these crazy guys, there was a guy on archery duty across a suspended beam. It felt as though the developers weren't afraid to show their invisible hand in the game and was actually pranking me. I was beginning to understand a little why this game was so controversial. At the end, I figured out that Dark Souls 2 had this built-in mechanism where if you kill the same enemy about 12 times, they would stop respawning. I imagined this was to make runbacks a bit easier, and it definitely did. It took quite a bit of time, and I wasn't even intentionally doing it because that was how many times I actually died. The worst part was, as soon as I entered the keep, I could see the boss fog on the other side of the bridge. It was always there, right there, and yet I died over and over trying to make it there. Eventually, after an hour of struggle, I finally made it inside the boss fog. Here, I encountered the Smelter Demon. So I know the Smelter Demon is supposed to be intimidating, but look at his little horns! Me. Anyways, the Smelter Demon has a very limited set of moves, and it really did feel like most of the fight was a little bit of brainless rinse and repeat. However, one very interesting mechanic spiced up this interaction. At about 70% of health left, the demon roars and adds a passive health drain in his vicinity. This made me change my rinse and repeat strategy, as I now had to take in consideration when to heal up. If I was too greedy with my attacks, I would leave myself with no time to heal and die from health drain. With this added layer of mental jujitsu, I found myself getting caught off my guard many times, getting huge chunks of my health bar taken out because I drank my flasks at the wrong time. After a few attempts, the sweet victory was mine. I went past the arena, accessing the inner part of Iron Keep. Here, aside from the Alone Knights, Undead Jailers, and even more lava, there were also fire-spewing statues. There was a clear visual consistency to indicate that I was still in the area of Iron Keep, but the additional traps and enemies also clearly indicated that I was progressing towards the end of the area, most likely going to be another boss. I followed the trail of enemies and available paths, eventually exiting the indoor structure, exposing myself to the open air. Far off into the distance, I saw a single narrow pathway leading to a platform in the middle of the lava. Judging by the white fog at the door, I could tell that this was going to be the final boss. Turned out I was right. As soon as I walked into the arena, a larger smelter demon with wings emerged from the lava. Never mind, he was way more intimidating. His name was the Old Iron King. He stood at the edge of the platform, roaring and swiping at me. I tried to avoid his grabs by rolling to the side. Yeah, I rolled into lava. I respawned and thought about what had just happened. The Old Iron King reminded me of the Centipede Demon and Quelaag from Dark Souls 1 in a way. All were set in arenas filled with lava and hinged on the mechanic of area denial. So not only did I need to dodge the Old Iron King's attacks, I also needed to be mindful of where I was dodging into. I had a lot of fun fighting this boss, and there was a real sense of fear, because compared to the size of the platform, the Old Iron King was comically large and aggressive. After a few attempts, I conquered him. Past his area was another primal bonfire, so I took it to mean that this was my second Great Soul. I returned to Majula and decided that it might finally be time to explore the black pit in the center. With the help of laddersmith Gilligan, I set up my pathway downward. I climbed down the ladder and jumped onto a platform. I followed yet another dark gray hallway. Again, what's with all the dark pathways? The deeper I went, the more everything around me reminded me of DS1. Blighttown from DS1 also started with a giant hole in the ground, then these ladders, then into the void. Okay, I guess the torches would be useful once again. Once I fell down through a floorboard and dropped down onto some rickety platform in the darkness, I was officially in the gutter. I looked into the distance, and it was so dark, truly, that the only things I could vaguely see were some glowing loot drops. There was also a fog wall at the corner of my screen, so I used that as my guiding light when navigating the scaffolding. The last time I heavily relied on torches was No Man's Dwarf. I talked about it back then about how it was so nice to light up the torch poles and use them as a progress bar. Here, I'm afraid is not just a nice bonus, but a must. The enemy types here weren't all that complicated. Some basic hollows, a couple of rupturing hollows. I think some of the other hollows have swords that were imbued in dark magic. I'm not sure, but they did a huge chunk of damage. There were also some poison ticks and dogs, but on the whole, these enemies were just plain annoying more than anything else. Every corner I turned, there was a chance that I would get poisoned all over myself, some random hollow was gonna explode on me, or better yet, I would just walk straight into the void. If there ever was an area to pay close attention to my environment, this would be it. Not only were there threats to my life, but there were also acid vats around enemies that if I weren't careful, I could break them and erode my own weapon. So with all this in mind, I took things very slowly. I looked to my left and right before every step. The thing is, I was very careful from moment to moment, but as a consequence, I ended up going in circles. I felt like this is a very pervasive experience for me in pretty much every game. I'm just a little bit directionally challenged, but DS2 is worse than all of the other games combined. If you're also directionally challenged, please let me know, because at this point, I'm just feeling self-conscious. I decided that the only way for me to see if I could break new ground was to look over every ledge and see if there were unexplored areas. I had to actually take out a pen and paper and try to mark down every turn I made. After about 2 hours of going back and forth, I finally went into an area with unlit torch poles. This is good. It meant that I was progressing. I found new bonfires soon after, and finally reached the fog I had been pining over since the beginning of the area. Crossing the fog to the other side, I was officially in the Black Gulch. I was actually a little surprised that the gutter didn't get its own boss since the area theme was so clear. Imagine how cool it would be to have a boss that uses the trick of light as part of its difficulty, sort of like the Curseblade boss from Night Rain, if you know what I'm talking about. But I guess the gutter and the Black Gulch were so close together that one just naturally led into another. Black Gulch is a really short area, probably even shorter than Heide's Tower. There were a few side coves I could loot, but the main path to the boss was a straight shot. Despite its incredibly simple layout, the eerie atmosphere left a strong impression on me. Black Gulch was dark, but not as dark as the gutter, all thanks to these glowing green poison statues. It's actually kind of funny watching them spew poison like they were spitting on me. It definitely made walking the 50 steps to the boss room harder as they were constantly staggering me, but the difficulty felt artificial. Now, you could say that all video game difficulties are technically artificial since, they're designed by humans. But I think there is a difference between difficulty that is a natural result of the environment, such as a fort guarded by soldiers and ballistas, versus difficulties that come from arbitrary number of annoyances. It really did feel like a random number of poison statues were placed and the devs just added or removed a few of them depending on their preferred difficulty. Now, one way to reduce some of these annoying projectiles was to break these statues with my weapon, but doing so risked prolonged exposure to other statues. After wasting a lot of life gems trying to clear all of the mobs on the way to the boss, I eventually just ran past all of the smaller mobs and straight to the boss. The Rotten was a spitting image of Nito from DS1, a monstrosity made up of 1,000 undead screaming in agony. The Rotten wields a cleaver and glides on the floor like a ghost. The arena was covered in pits of fire, surrounded by little stone statues, so there was that aspect of area denial mechanic that we had seen prior in the game. Overall, the Rotten was an easy fight. His main attacks came from the cleaver, but he moved slowly, and it took him 1,000 years to just turn around. The key to this fight was to be mindful of the fire pits, hug the Rotten's back, and chop and repeat. The camera was another big obstacle in this fight, though a part of me feels bad bringing this up because there was so much going on in the arena that it was almost natural that my experience felt a little chaotic. Thematically, the Rotten was a very fitting final boss of the underground, so to speak. Through the darkness that was filled by poison, it was only reasonable to have a rotten monster waiting to put me on the chopping block. I fought the camera for the majority of the fight, but overall, the Rotten was an easy and quick boss. Once I defeated him, I was sent back to Majula via another primal bonfire. So that was my third great soul. After I was back in Majula, I was once again lost about where I should go next. This is either a weird character flaw of mine or something about the layout of DS2 that made organic progression super difficult for me, because at this point, Google had become my best friend. One thing that made me feel slightly better was how many Reddit threads existed to guide people without spoiling too much content. Does this mean that there are a lot more people out there who were just as lost as me? I followed this one guy's advice to quote-unquote backtrack to the road from things betwixt. I started walking backwards onto the dirt path that led to Majula at the very beginning. Right at the entrance to the cave that led to the tutorial area, there was another cave opening right next to it. It was actually pretty visible from the main road, so I imagine if I was truly meticulous and traced every step I took, it was a matter of time before I would stumble onto this path. I followed the hallway all the way to its end, where a petrified statue blocked a lever to the gate I needed to pass. I used a fragrant branch of yore and revealed an NPC. She told me her name was Rosabeth, and then proceeded to ask me for clothes. I was genuinely confused and thought we were having a little dress to impress moment. But looking through her interaction menu, it looked like I could reinforce my pyromancy flame with her. I had been using some pyromancy up to this point just to have some ranged options, so I took note of her and went on my way. After fighting my way through an entrapment brought down by the lever I pulled, I found a bonfire at an interesting intersection of 3 divergent paths. Standing in front of these forked roads, I realized this might be a turning point of the game. Up to this point, Majula had been the hub that hosted different paths of expedition. I picked one path and followed it to the end, then I would return to Majula for the next one. But here I was, at a new hub for the next 3 paths. This sudden change made me feel like I might be on to the second half of the game. The stakes would be higher, and I would have to play more carefully. I decided to approach them in order, starting with the right-hand side. The archway to the right was the most unique of the 3. Standing at the threshold, I could only see a few steps in front of me. Everything seemed to be coated in a thick layer of fog. I tried to look around to see if I had options on which direction to go, but other than a few bloodstains and online messages, there were no other clues to go off of. I decided to follow the bloodstains and see where they would take me. I kept walking forward, following a trail of bloodstains, and it started to feel like I was in a paranormal horror movie. Clearly people died, a lot, all over this place, but from what? As far as I could tell, there was not a single soul in the woods other than me. It was after I had picked up a few loot drops and walked for quite a while, I heard an arrow whooshing by. This was actually way better than what I thought it was going to be. I followed the arrow to see who was shooting it, trying to use lock-on to help me find this mysterious enemy. To my surprise, I could see the arrow coming out of a white shadow, but I couldn't lock on to him. I walked over and without lock-on, whacked him over the head with my weapon. I saw a health bar decrease over his head. Okay, so he can die. This is good. As I walked on, there were a few more of these white ghost guys. I could see how people die so many times. They move in complete silence and always attempted to sneak up on me. If I wasn't paying close attention and really tried to get them before they could get me, I would have died so many more times than I could count. You know, this area reminded me of Ordina, liturgical town from Elden Ring. The lack of visibility to get there, the invisible enemies. Though these guys here were way more merciful than the Black Knife assassins. I was going to talk about how I felt lost in this area as well, but I realized that this would probably be the 5th or 6th times that I'm saying this exact same thing in this video. I'm tired of it, you're tired of it, and okay, but I still need to bring this up. There's a point to this that I want to talk about later. My ineptitude at navigation in this game is important, I promise. Eventually, I found a spiraling path upward where the fog started to dissipate. By the end of the path, the fog had completely receded. I had entered a new area, the Shaded Ruins. Here, dilapidated walls were crumbling and every corner was filled with cursed pots, basilisks, and iron warriors. Overall, I was a little disappointed at the visual presentation of this area. Many of the twists and turns felt very reminiscent of the Forest of the Fallen Giants. The first time I saw them, it was fun and novel, but now it was just boring. The foliage texture felt the same, and there wasn't any unique element that appropriately broke up the monotony. Genuinely, I felt bored. I wanted to explore mystery and secrets, and there just didn't seem to be any. I decided to skip over the boring optional part and just go straight for the boss. The faster I could go to the next area, the better. At the end of a slope, I met the area boss, Scorpioness Nachka, or Quelaag 2.0. I mean, seriously, look at her. It felt like I was fighting Quelaag again, but in a new skin. Nachka is in the shape of a humanoid on top of a scorpion. Her attacks were reminiscent of Quelaag, but her hitboxes were very different. It took me some time fighting her to actually figure out what she was doing. There was one move in particular that got me every single time, the side-swiping motion her scorpion claws did. For a while, whenever I saw her winding up for the attack, I always thought that she was going to swipe me with her spear, the way Quelaag did. It was only when I died so many times I had to rewatch my own footage to realize that it was her scorpion half that was doing the actual attack. Thinking she was similar to Quelaag actually messed me up here. Naksha would dodge my attacks, which was also very frustrating at times because I felt like I had waited for my turn but didn't get to actually take it. But the upside of this fight was that Naksha's recovery time was long, so after I successfully dodged her attacks, I had a long counter-attack window. Overall, Naksha was an okay fight to end this otherwise unremarkable area. I got my wish to move on to the next area, the doors of Pharros. I walked into this giant hall filled with what seemed to be infinite coves of contraptions. For some reason, the room was also filled with almost waist-deep water. The name of the area, Doors of Pharros, is in reference to a consumable item and a game mechanic. Since the beginning of the game, there had been contraptions in various locations that required a consumable, the Pharros Lockstone, to activate. There weren't uniform prizes or consequences, as each contraption had their own unique setup. I hadn't interacted with this mechanic many times in my gameplay, but I did use one stone to activate a large overhead lighting in No Man's Dwarf. I was curious about what other usages there were that I had missed, so I looked it up. Apparently, some revealed secret areas, some hid precious loot, and for the ones hidden in this area, most of them were actually traps. I didn't have much interest in testing these contraptions out one by one, but I really loved the design of this mechanic as a whole. The Pharros Lockstone vaguely reminded me of the Stone Sword Key mechanic in Elden Ring. Obviously, the usage of the Pharros Lockstone is a lot more varied compared to the Stone Sword Key's only opening Everjails, but both were items that could be used to unlock optional content. From a visual design perspective, the atmosphere of this area felt like it existed outside of time and space. The uniform stone textures of the ground and the walls felt archaic, yet the geometric shapes on the wall looked futuristic in a way. I didn't actually care about trying to figure out every single contraption for myself, so I walked around like a tourist, skipped past the area boss, and went straight to the next area, Brightstone Cove, Tseldora. At this point, as I'm writing this script, I realize I've been sanitizing some of my disappointments with Dark Souls 2, so time for me to come clean. One of my favorite things about Dark Souls 2 is the unique thematic designs of each individual area. I love that every area I explore has such intricate world building. All the enemies, layout, music, and visual design make sense in that particular setting. I'm genuinely amazed that FromSoft managed to come up with all these fantastical areas that are self-contained, but also lead well into one another. Well, maybe not all of them, like the elevator into the sky volcano of Iron Keep. But for every bit I was amazed and intrigued by the beginning areas, I was equally disappointed in the last few areas. The mist area back at the Shaded Woods was interesting conceptually, but that sense of novelty stopped being interesting after 20 seconds. Yeah, I fumbled around in a sea of fog for a bit, but that was it. Then the Shaded Ruins. I already mentioned that I skipped straight to the boss. I just didn't care much about the reused textures at all. Doors of Pharros was, again, interesting conceptually, but my actual experience of the area was also just uneventful. And now, Brightstone Cove. When I emerged from the cave where the area bonfire was, I was getting excited because that entrance reminded me of discovering Majula for the first time. But this time, I was thoroughly disappointed. The tents, the grass, and the enemies, it felt like I had already seen something like it in the game. The first boss of the area, Prowling Magnus and the Congregation, is hands down the most boring boss fight of the game for me. It was almost comical because I could see the dev's hand trying to make it a gang fight where you had to navigate around 3 leaders and a bunch of followers in a church, but the actual execution felt messy. For most of the fight, I was just looking at them and laughing because they were so disorganized. The 3 leaders were using magic and miracles, but once you dodged the projectiles and just walked up to them, they were completely defenseless. I made it past this weird church on my first try and ended up in a sandy area past the arena. Now see, this area has a much more distinct visual identity. Why couldn't we just skip to this part? The theme of this area was spiders. Everywhere I went, there were spiders. Sometimes hidden in dark rooms, sometimes under the sand. The thing that makes these spiders special is that they're afraid of torches. They shy away from torches but will still attack given enough time. Learning this fact was really important for the final boss of the area, the Duke's Dear Freya. Now, this isn't my first rodeo. Night Rain gave me a taste already. Duke's Dear Freya is a very simple boss fight. Only the 2 heads on each side of the spider are vulnerable to damage. The rest is just to work around the little swarms of spiders. Thankfully, the little spiders were still afraid of my torch, which was foreshadowed really well by this entire area. As long as I held a torch in one hand, the little spiders cleared the way for me to focus on Freya. But because it was so easy to trivialize this gank fight with a torch, it felt anticlimactic to this whole section of the game. I beat her on my first try. Past the boss arena was another primal bonfire. When I interacted with it, a large tree-like being emerged from the ground and told me to seek King Vendrick. Got it. I had gotten my last great soul and was ready to move on to the last leg of my journey. I remembered the remaining 2 paths in the Shaded Woods and was eager to see what this King Vendrick was all about. It felt like the entire game thus far had been building up to this mystery. Who is King Vendrick? I was a little afraid that my expectations would be thoroughly let down since DS2 had been a little unpredictable with their area quality thus far. I decided to try the left archway this time. It seemed like I was on the right path to find the king because I started seeing soldiers. Soldiers equal castle equal king. I was excited because FromSoft's castle in every game had been breathtaking. As I was walking down the path, I remembered Anorlando, Lothric Castle, Academy Luia Ricaria. Every single one of them is big, intricate, and full of secrets. I followed the path, taking many twists and turns, eventually stepping out onto a rainy and dark road. At the far end of this road was Drangleic Castle. It was such a chilling atmosphere. The rain obscured so much of my sight on the way here, only able to see a few feet ahead of me at a time. But then I turned a corner, and there was this giant castle off in the distance, and an ascending staircase guarded by 2 elephant-shaped knights. The staircase leading up to the castle was so grand and so long. The longer this lead up was, the more gravity it felt to actually arrive at the destination. When I finally reached the gates of the castle, I couldn't figure out how to open them. This was another one of those DS2 gimmicks that I was amused by. When I approached the gates, there were royal swordsmen appearing out of nowhere, rushing to fight me. I killed a few of them, and one of them had a piece of their soul flying towards the golem next to the gate. To my surprise, the heart of the golem turned blue, and he turned the bowl he was holding. It was completely accidental that this had happened that led me to replicating on the other golem to open the gate. I imagine the game wanted you to find this out by accident, but it felt unintuitive. The game up to this point rewarded patience and strategy, so when there was a swarm of soldiers approaching, the best strategy was actually to single them out one by one. The chances that I would kill them right by the gate was slim, but I guess I did, which probably meant that eventually I would figure this out. Once both golems lit up and turned their bowl, the gates opened. The inside of the castle was surprisingly small in its appearance. I didn't know what I was expecting, but probably a grander hall with giant guards. It was quiet inside and mostly empty except for a few soldiers that came alive from petrified statues when I approached. I found a bonfire inside, then wandered about for a while. I'm gonna be honest, I was disappointed. It felt like the inside didn't live up to the outside. It's funny because the outside looks 10 times bigger. I was thinking that the devs either didn't care to make the inside scale match the outside, or there was some secret compartment that I hadn't yet seen. I wandered into a dark hall filled with stone soldiers. Along the edges of the room were doors with the golem mechanisms like the castle gates. When these soldiers came alive, I killed them near the doors again, and it worked. Their souls were absorbed into the doors, and they opened. Only one of these doors actually led to progression. I weaved between rooms and bridges outside that connected different parts of the castle. In one of the rooms, I met an NPC by the name of Nashandra. She told me that she was the queen of the castle and that I should seek King Vendrick. I thought it was a bit odd that she was sitting far back into the room in an almost empty castle, all by herself, but I was too eager to explore the rest of the castle to care. Eventually, I found another boss fog. This next boss, duo Dragon Riders, were literally just duplicates of the Dragon Rider back at Heide's tower. There was no real flair to it, just a pure, simple gang fight. I feel like I've been cutting so much slack for DS2 when it comes to boss fights because I kept saying that I didn't mind that some of the bosses were underwhelming, but honestly, I was thoroughly disappointed with this one. Dual bosses are fine, Exhibit A, Ornstein and Smo, but two identical bosses that act with no regards to one another just feels messy and frustrating. Would it have been better to not have a boss here at all? Honestly, probably. When it comes to bosses, I now believe that not having one is better than having a boring one. I spent a lot of time in this next section trying to figure a way out. I was surprised to see that I was still inside the castle, because I had just fought a boss, but maybe this was why the castle looked so big on the outside. The enemies were a strange mix. Some headless mannequins, a strange ghost guy in the wall, a random two-headed horse that I later found out was actually a boss from an optional area, half-naked pyromancers, and a gargoyle. None of it made sense. You know what it feels like? It's like the castle was a museum for all the species that existed in this game. And remember how I was looking forward to exploring this castle because every other FromSoft castle was so cool? I hate to say it, but Drangleic Castle was the most disappointing of them all. Don't get my hopes up just to let me down. I'm looking at you, woman with 3 teeth. Progression was through a door close to the bonfire in this section. Passing through a dark hallway, I came face to face with the Looking Glass Knight. Okay, for every bit of disappointment I just expressed a few seconds ago, I take it all back for this boss fight. When I entered the boss arena, it was like I had arrived at the eye of the storm. Under heavy storm and flashes of lightning, the Looking Glass Knight jumped at me, attempting to slice me in half. He had a silver chrome body and wielded a lightning-imbued sword and a mirror shield. Despite being a humanoid soldier like many of the other enemies in this game, the Looking Glass Knight moved a lot faster and his attack ranges were a lot wider, making him way more dynamic and interesting. And that's not it. At about 60% health, the knight readied his shield on the ground, seemingly charging up for his next move. I was a little afraid he was going to explode or something, so I stuck to his back. All of a sudden, another silver soldier broke free from his mirror shield. This soldier was a lot smaller in size than the knight. Even though this technically turned into a gank fight, I was not in the slightest bit annoyed. I focused my energy on the little guy, and while we dueled, the Looking Glass Knight was a lot more passive. This felt a lot more fair because I could avoid getting ganked on by careful positioning. I was so absorbed in the rhythm of the fight, adoring the boss design as I methodically worked my way through. When I defeated the knight, I was almost sad that I wasn't able to enjoy it longer. 10 out of 10, I have no complaints. This was a masterpiece in boss choreography and atmosphere. I really wish every boss fight could be like this one. Chef's kiss. Past the boss arena and down the elevator, I arrived at the Shrine of Amana. Let me just give you a little spoiler here. This area was probably the most fantastical and ethereal area in the entire game, but also the single most annoying area. It's ethereal because the moment you walk into the area, there's a faint song far off in the distance, softly whispering a gentle tune. The entire area is a large, clear lake. There's stone paths that lead to little huts in the water, there's sprinkling lights, fluorescent flowers, and torch poles, and even the enemies who patrol the paths are uptight pilgrims who wear white robes. The atmosphere reminded me of a wonderland, so even when the pilgrims spotted me and started chasing me down, I was still very much enjoying every second of my environment. It's annoying because of way too many things. Let's see. Exhibit A, these Archdrake pilgrims who gave me a really hard time for some reason. They attacked aggressively and had a surprisingly large health bar. They often had long aggro ranges and pursued me relentlessly. Exhibit B, mages. I think they're called priestesses, which sound really nice, but they aren't all that nice. They're spaced out in that perfect interval to always have two of them on you at all times. I had to try and kill one, all while another mage was trying to shoot me down with her long-range magic pew-pews. Difficult combat is one thing, but this kind of magic barrage didn't feel difficult. It just felt frustrating. One thing I noticed that I thought made the enemies a bit more reasonable was that there were subsections of the area that became progressively more difficult with enemy variety. At first, it was just the prowling enemies and the pilgrims, then they added priestesses and aberrations. Then at the final section, it was a whole squad of both the pilgrims and the priestesses. This progression gave me time to practice against one enemy type, get used to them, and only once I was comfortable with what was already there, the game then added additional enemies. Eventually, I had to pull out a bow and arrow to try and get ahead of my enemies. I would try to either shoot them dead with arrows before they could get to me, or to single out individual enemies to take them on one by one. This strategy worked, and after many deaths and one too many hours stuck in this area, I finally made it to the boss, Demon of Song. The Demon of Song is a frog-like creature that has a grotesque skull face. When I approached, his arms emerged and pulled down the folds to hide his face. His exterior was made from sturdy and defensive armor, so the only way to damage him was to wait for him to come out of his shell to attack me. In the brief window after his attack was my opportunity. Once I figured out this pattern, it was a quick rinse and repeat until he died. Right here is the perfect example of what I was talking about before. This boss was easy, but his design was fascinating to look at, and there was a gimmick that worked well in this context. So despite his extremely simple attack patterns, this fight remained interesting. Past the Demon of Song arena was an elevator that brought me all the way down to the underground. Here in the darkness was the Undead Crypt. Filled with sorcerers and guards, this place was difficult for me to progress. I fought my way through the entrance many times, only to die to random NPC invasions. I think this was the first time I really felt like the game had a late-game difficulty spike. This area was extremely dark, so using a torch was a must. I complained about Tomb of Giants in my DS1 video, but here we go again. I enjoy exploration, but only if I can actually see what I'm exploring. Although fitting for the name Undead Crypt, this area loses the opportunity to really showcase its underground atmosphere. I will say, because of the darkness, I was definitely a lot more on edge and rushed quite a bit in my exploration. I wasn't 100% sure I wouldn't be lost, so every time I broke new ground, I was desperate to keep running to the next checkpoint. The area boss was heavily guarded by rows of pyromancers, sorcerers, and soldiers. I did my best to run past all of them to face the boss, Velstadt, the Royal Aegis. Velstadt looked a lot like the Looking Glass Knight, but unlike the Looking Glass Knight who was erratic and aggressive, Velstadt reverted back to that slow combat pacing we had seen earlier in the game. I was genuinely surprised because it felt like he was a lot easier than many of the basic enemies in this area. Once defeated, the arena opened up to an area behind that contained an item called the King's Ring. This was a key item that would enable me to progress in the game. In all honesty, I was relieved to have finished this area and just be able to move on from the boredom I felt here. Now that I had completed 2 out of the 3 paths back at the Shaded Woods, there was only one more central path left to complete. The middle path felt like another portal to a fairy tale world. An ogre was resting in a pond when I walked along the grassy path. He tried to flatten me by literally falling on top of me, and I narrowly escaped. Past the angry ogre was a beautiful, large gate. When I walked up to it, a prompt showed up telling me to produce the symbol of the king. It was nice to know I was on the right path in the right order since I had just obtained the king's ring. Past the gate, I was officially in Aldia's keep. You know what this place reminds me of? The specimen storehouse from Shadow of the Erdtree DLC of Elden Ring. There was a giant creature skeleton in the middle of the keep, spiraling upwards to the ceiling. There were ascending staircases going up to higher levels. Standing in the middle of the open hall, I felt like I was in a museum, observing fossils and immersing myself in the ecology of Drangleic. I walked around the first floor and came across a row of mirror shields on the wall. I recognized these mirrors because they look exactly the same as the Looking Glass Knight shield. There were soldiers trapped inside each of them, struggling to break free. After a moment of struggle, a few of them made it through the mirror. It was such a cool throwback. But despite the cool aesthetics and theme of this area, the front of the keep was actually surprisingly small. Other than the few soldiers from the wall, there weren't much more secrets or things to interact with. At the top of the stairs was a door that led to the rest of the keep. Past this door was one of the coolest moments I experienced in DS2. Before me was a long stretch of hallway with tall ceilings. There were pieces of furniture like paintings, tables, cabinets, and chairs all sprinkled on the side. The thing that truly amazed me was the rows of wired cages hanging from the ceiling like lanterns. These cages were filled with creatures, enemies from all of Dark Souls 2. Mimic chests, poison ticks, ogres, these were just a few I could see from first glance. I half expected that they would all jump out of their cages and gank on me like some sort of a trap, but much to my surprise, they really were just collected specimens that stayed in their place. Seeing all the enemies from different parts of the game all grouped up together in this context really immersed me in the environment. It reminded me once again that this was a keep that collected all the specimens. On each side of the hallway, there were rooms filled with various acid vats and enemies, but the main progression is at the end of the hallway, the area boss, the Guardian Dragon. I don't know, I genuinely can't come up with anything to say about this fight. Think of any other FromSoft dragon fight. Yeah, it's exactly the way you think it is. He flew away, I waited, he attacked, I dodged, I attacked back, fire breath here and there, boom, done. FromSoft dragon bosses are their signature. There are always a couple of them in every game. They all look super cool, and the whole concept of a medieval knight fighting a dragon is also super cool. But in practice, these fights are a drag. It's truly turn-based combat to the max, except it's almost never your turn. I want to complain and say that FromSoft can do better, but I also have to admit that at some point when your enemy is about 30 times the size of you, there's only so much one can do. I suppose I would only hope that I can get a better camera and lock on, so that at least I can get a better view of the dragon while I'm busy running away from his fire breath. But little did I know, the guardian dragon was just the beginning of my foot in the true dragon's nest. The next area, the heart of the dragon's nest, Dragon Aerie, was just a short elevator ride away. I saw the mountains growing further away as the elevator went up, and I emerged on the tip of a mountain with dragons circling like birds in the sky. This was such a dynamic shift. Aldia's keep was quiet, still, sterile, like a museum, whereas Dragon Aerie was filled with energy and the sound of dragon wings batting in the air. I dare say this area might be the predecessor of crumbling Faerû Majula in Elden Ring. I think of this area a bit like a constellation of dragon nests, connected by suspending wooden bridges. Lots of exploding hollows lay in wait in the various nooks and crannies. Even worse than the exploding hollows in the previous areas, the hollows here explode with acid, damaging you and your equipment. I learned to always peek around the corner and take every step with caution. As intricate as Dragon Aerie appeared at first glance, the actual experience of it was somewhat monotonous. The enemy variety wasn't large, and most of the major combat experiences were with dragons. And you already know how I feel about them, starting with the Guardian Dragon earlier. So I kept moving forward, eventually crossing a swaying bridge, entering the next area, Dragon Shrine. So it seems like Dragon Aerie was more so a transitory space rather than its own contained dungeon. I feel much better knowing this since Dragon Aerie didn't even have an area boss. Dragon Shrine is such a fascinating area. Even though the low humming of the dragons flying was still the backdrop, the actual area was oddly peaceful. When I walked up the stairs to enter this castle-like structure, there was a large old knight stationed at the center of the platform. He approached slowly when he saw me. This felt familiar as he moved in the same way the Heide's knights did. What surprised me though were the knights on the periphery of the platforms. They would always turn to face me, wherever I went, but still in their station, unmoving. I was very curious as to what their deal was, so I looked it up. These enemies are called Dragon Knight, and the one unique thing about them is that they're non-hostile to the player by default. They will only attack you if you're playing co-op or if you run away from a fight with the Drake Keepers, the larger knights. I really love the lore implication of this, as it's basically saying, hey, don't be a coward, come forth and fight. True to the spirit of a lone adventure. Lore aside, the area was extremely short. I made it to the top of the structure in less than 10 minutes and met the ancient dragon lying in wait. I was genuinely surprised that this encounter was not a boss fight, but one where the dragon gifted me the Ashen Mist Heart, a key item to peer into the fog in hope of answers. The area where the ancient dragon rested was a dead end, so I took it to note that my quest at this branch of the map had concluded. My journey in Drangleic almost came to an end, but before I tackled the ending, I wanted to experience the DLCs first. There are 3 DLCs total, and I completed them in order of difficulty as suggested by a random guy on Reddit. I first started with the Crown of the Sunken King. Access through the portal past the Rotten's Arena in the Black Gulch, Shova, Sanctum City, was the first location of this DLC. I struggled to find words to describe the view I saw when I exited the cave through the portal, but let's just say that it was one of the most awe-inspiring views I had seen in video games. Far off in the distance was a temple, connected to another one via a long and thin suspended bridge. I was underground, but instead of an oppressive and claustrophobic atmosphere, there was an air of calmness and vastness. It felt religious. It didn't take me too long to figure out that this DLC not only had an aesthetic theme, but also a unique mechanism that was pervasive throughout. Many platforms were movable once I hit certain pressure plates that were connected to them. It was like a little puzzle to solve so that I could reach places where I couldn't otherwise. I really loved the whole concept of this place, and I could tell that a lot of effort was put into making it challenging but also fun. Fighting and dodging enemies while I was trying to find the next pressure plate was definitely adrenaline-inducing. This DLC had narrowed the scope of visual identity and theme, and it was very noticeable. A lot of the structures, textures, enemy types, and layouts all fit within this underground tomb and temple vibe. There was not a single aspect that strayed from this core atmosphere. I consider it an enhancement to the base game, as the areas had oscillating levels of area cohesion. Here, it was a 10 out of 10 for my sense of immersion. There is a downside to this cohesion though, and that is the risk of monotony. I started to sense this when I crossed the long suspended bridge to the inside of the Dragon Temple. Shova Sanctum City benefited from this cohesion because it contained different types of vantage points. At almost every corner of the city, I was always a few steps away from being able to see the entirety of the city. The depth of field was a great way to break up the otherwise monochromatic design. Once I entered the Dragon Temple, however, this depth of field no longer existed. The inside was filled with tight corners and aggressive enemies, and even though the temple introduced new types of enemies such as dark mages and specter warriors, which by the way, they very much reminded me of the divine beast warriors from Shadow of the Erdtree, the visual fatigue of the claustrophobic environment still felt discouraging. Progression relied heavily on solving these contraption puzzles. The pressure plate for a lot of these moving parts were spread across all surfaces of the temple. Some were close to the ceiling, only accessible through a projectile, while others were a bit more obvious. It took me a lot of trial and error to figure out the right way forward. Eventually, at the end of this area, came the boss, Elena, the Squalid Queen. She is a humanoid mage who summons other enemies to aid her in battle. She herself was an easy target, as her projectiles had clear telegraphs and long wind-ups. However, positioning myself when her phantom warriors were also present became a challenge. She turns passive whenever one of her minions was doing her bidding, but she would occasionally fire off a few spells. So while she wasn't an active threat, it was still important to be able to keep her in my field of vision. It was an interesting fight that actually went by pretty quickly. Once I figured out how to maneuver the camera and find a rhythm to the fight, it became a matter of rinse and repeat. When I defeated her, I thought it was the end of this DLC, but not yet. There was a thin passageway past the arena that took me to another wide boss fog. Beyond the fog was the true final boss of the DLC, Sin, the slumbering dragon. I know I had complained a lot about dragon fights across my channel, but I dare say that this was actually not a bad one. A common issue for a lot of these dragon fights is that they spend so much time in the air that it feels like turn-based combat except it's never your turn. But this one was different. Sin is a fight that respects the player's agency. He did fly quite a bit, yes, but after every flight, he stayed on the ground for a decent amount of time for me to attack. The majority of his moves were also bound to the ground, which made his fight actually interactive and fun. It took me a few tries as I struggled quite a bit with his attack timings, but eventually, with the help of NPC Transcendent Ed, I took down Sin. This victory marked the actual ending of the first DLC, Crown of the Sunken King. I thought that this whole Crown of the King was a metaphor, but you actually do get a little crown to wear. How cute! My next destination was Crown of the Ivory King. Entrance to this DLC was located in the Shrine of Winter on the way to Drangleic Castle. When I emerged from the portal, I think I actually gasped. What was in front of me was a snowy, dreamy landscape. The aesthetics took a drastic departure from the base game, and I was excited to see how it would utilize this snowy theme through its level design. To enter the proper DLC, I had to approach a gigantic gate covered in ice. A soft voice told me to turn back, but of course, I, with my extreme oppositional reflex, was not going to do that, so I squeezed through the crack in the frozen gate anyway. Past the gate was the city of frozen Ilium Lois. Side note, Ilium Lois, what a beautiful and unique name, the type of beautiful video game name that some random celebrity would name their child after. Unfortunately, the city was in the midst of a snowstorm. I could vaguely see the shape of a beautiful castle in the distance and some ornate streets below, but my entire screen was covered in a layer of white snowy fog. This whole thing made me feel like I hadn't cleaned my monitor screen in ages. Design choices like this are intentional and thematically cohesive, but in the case of Ilium Lois, that cohesion came at a cost of a smoother user experience. Once I entered the indoor section of the buildings, the storm had faded. So now, instead of a monotonous environment, I had to deal with monotonous enemies. Similar to the enemies in Crown of the Sunken King, the enemies here integrated into their environment extremely well. Most of them were constructed of white crystals and were inert until I approached them. Some of them wielded ice spear magic, which was also white. The white on white on white color palette put a lot of strain on my eyes just to understand what was going on. At some point in my journey, I came across a key item called Eye of the Priestess. Item description informed me that this would allow me to see the unseen. It wasn't immediately clear to me what this item was for, but once I followed the path forward to the end, I jumped off a ledge and realized that I was back at where I started. It seemed like I was supposed to turn left next at the fork of the starting point, since I took the right path to get to this point. So here, I took the left turn, entering the fog gate. Ava, the king's pet, was the first boss I encountered in this DLC. I genuinely don't have much to say about this boss except that it was a very jumpy tiger with magic. You know what Ava reminded me of? The Red Wolf of Ratigan. Except with the level of mobility DS2 gave me, I constantly felt like I was just a little bit slow on the uptake. I struggled against it quite a bit as I couldn't figure out a fitting window to heal. It took me a few tries to get used to the rhythm, and with the help of 2 NPCs, I finally beat it. Past Ava, I entered a grand hall. Here was where things got interesting. An echoing voice told me that the city's king was stranded in the old chaos, and asked me for a favor to help him. Sure, why not? I answered her plea. And then a line of text appeared on my screen. Alsana's seal is undone, and the winds of Ilium Lois are seized. It took me a minute to realize how this had anything to do with me, since I thought I was going straight for the final boss. But then I remembered all of the frozen chests and pathways I had seen in the city. This probably meant that all of the previously inaccessible parts were now open to me. At this point in my DS2 journey, I had more than enough weapons, healing items, and consumables, so I didn't actually care about whatever treasures I had missed, but I was interested in seeing what it would feel like to retread those grounds. I wanted to see what was behind the fog first, then go back to re-explore the city. When I approached the fog gate under the stairs, a knight stood up from his chair, readying up with me. I noticed that there were a few more chairs that were empty and wondered where these missing knights went. Once I crossed the fog, I fell straight into the void. Classic. The knight also jumped with me. Together, we fell to the bottom of this hole, a hellish place called the Old Chaos. The knight and I stood on a platform suspended in lava, and it wasn't immediately apparent that we were in a boss fight since nothing spawned. I walked forward into the center of the arena, and that was when I saw 3 Dark Lois Knights walking through the portals at the edges of the platform. They all charged me once, each wielding a different weapon. This turned into an overwhelming gank fight real fast. I failed pretty quickly too. The gank squad was just too much. I remember the missing knights at the top of this hole, but I couldn't remember where to recruit them, so I consulted Reddit here again. It turned out that the knights were spread out across different parts of the town, and I just happened to miss them on my first tour. This was actually a good incentive for me to go back and re-explore, since I had intended to do so anyway after the ice melted. The actual journey of locating these knights was surprisingly difficult. I encountered the more formidable variants of enemies this time around, such as witch trees and little spiky hedgehogs that run you over at the speed of light. This was most definitely the part where I started to get heavy visual fatigue. Despite it being a cool factor to re-explore the town, my eyes were getting bored by the white pixels everywhere. I looked everywhere for these nights not because I necessarily wanted to or that it was fun to scrape this place, but because the burnt Ivory King was too difficult for me without the help of these NPCs. I followed guides religiously to finally reach and liberate these Lois Knights in their containment unit to help me. When I arrived at the boss arena once again with my 3 Lois Knights, we began a true battle with the burnt Ivory King. This boss fight was almost ceremonial in nature. We began the battle by fighting other Lois Knights who entered through the portals, and only once we defeated a few of them, my own Lois Knights sacrificed themselves to freeze over the portal, one by one. Eventually, a bigger portal emerged at the center of the arena, and there came the actual burnt Ivory King. The king was dressed just like the other Lois Knights. He wielded a sword and moved surprisingly fast. But from here on, the burnt Ivory King fight became a pretty standard guy with a sword fight. I think here was a pretty good example of how life gems fundamentally changed the nature of this interaction. The lead-up gang fight plus the actual boss fight in one sitting made this encounter a test of patience and resource management. In any other Souls games, unless you can perfectly beat the Lois Knights unscathed, by the time the actual boss arrives, you'd be struggling with healing items. There's a scarcity mindset that haunts the fight, adding lots of additional pressure and stakes. But with the aid of infinite life gems, I didn't really feel that intense fear of running out of heals. As far as I knew, as long as I was patient and took my turn, I basically had infinite healing and time to pace out my fight. Granted, I struggled the most with this boss fight out of the entire DS2 boss roster, mostly due to me running out of patience with how long the fight was. And in my haste to end the boss fight, I made a lot of stupid mistakes that led to my defeat. Thankfully, there were multiple NPCs I could summon, as well as actual players. With their help, I was able to beat the burnt Ivory King at the end. This victory awarded me with another crown, the Crown of the Ivory King. All there was left was the Crown of the Old King DLC. The entrance to this DLC is gated behind the Old Iron King boss arena. I had previously mentioned how I dislike fire-themed areas since the red coloring quickly overstimulates me. Well, I'd say that this DLC is the epitome of that overstimulation central. From the fire-spewing statues, to the patrolling fire-wielding enemies, to the ashes that cover most of the outdoor area, everything is on brand for an area that is basically a giant furnace. To be honest, I don't have much to say about this DLC. For the most part, it feels unremarkable to me. It isn't bad or unpleasant by any means, but a lot of the platforming and ladder climbing feels quite samey to me at this point. The only thing that truly stumped me for quite a while was the blue smelter demon. I came across the iron passage by accident while I was searching for the final boss, thinking that this was the path forward. It took me quite a few tries to take down the blue smelter demon, not because of how difficult the boss was. I mean, it's the same boss as the one found in Iron Keep, just with an additional health drain. The reason for my unreasonable number of deaths was the run back from the bonfire to the boss arena. For some reason, there was an ungodly amount of mages and the soldiers dogpiling me every chance they got. People always say that the Scholar of the First Sin edition added many gang-style enemies. Now, I don't know what this place is like in the original game, but it definitely screams unfair gangs to me. When I finally defeated the blue smelter demon, I was extremely disappointed that it was a dead end in terms of progression. I was back at where I started, still in search of the final boss. I consulted Google once again and eventually found the Fume Knight at the bottom of the Broom Tower. I have to admit, I had a lot of fun fighting this boss. At first glance, this was just another guy in armor fight. The Fume Knight wields a straight sword in his right hand and a greatsword in his left. What made this fight interesting was precisely the two different weapons. Due to their difference in size, their attack hitboxes are vastly different. If I was too close when he swung the greatsword, I was bound to take massive damage. But if I was too far when he swung the straightsword, I would miss my attack window. Anticipating his moves and finding the rhythm to the fight became captivating. An additional gimmick to this fight was the ashen dolls around the exterior of the Fume Knight's boss arena. If left undealt with, the Fume Knight could draw infinite healing from them. So to make the boss fight easier for myself, I used the smelter wedges to disable them. It's a trivial gimmick at the end of the day, but I appreciate the effort. Defeating the Fume Knight earned me the crown of the Old King. Now that I have completed the DLCs, it's time for the final boss. Entrance to the final area is a previously locked gate in Drangleic Castle. With the King's Ring, I now have access to the Throne of Want. After a long, windy path, I arrived at the boss fog. Turns out it wasn't the final boss just yet. It was a dual boss fight, Throne Watcher and Throne Defender. I really wish they had skipped this fight. Okay, now is a good time as ever to talk about something I've been wanting to mention all video long. DS2 has too many boss fights, and many of them are too similar. In my last review on DS1, I had said that I loved guy in armor fights, but everything in moderation, you know? DS2 has so many dudes in armor that all behave similarly but with different skins. I get the urge to put a boss fight after every area, sometimes even two, but if for one reason or another they all become similar, then I'd rather there not be a boss fight at all. The sheer number and repeat experiences just cheapen it. Like this pseudo-final boss. I came all this way expecting an ultimate experience, all to face another pair of dudes in armor. Now, what was more puzzling was what happened after I defeated this pair of Throne Watcher and Defender. Nothing. Nothing happened. I walked around the boss arena thoroughly confused and examined every inch of it just to make sure that there wasn't a blatantly obvious passageway that I was blind to. But as far as I could tell, it was a dead end. I went back to Majula and just stared into the void for a little bit. I tried to think about what I did at the last section of the game that might inform me on what to do next. It was after quite a while of head scratching that I remember the item Ashen Mist Heart I had received from the Ancient Dragon. Item description said that it is used to delve into the memories of the withered. It was heavily implied that I was to use this as a key to unlock quote-unquote memories, but the question was where and how. This part was where I struggled the most because I could not recall for the life of me where I might be able to find withered things. In hindsight, I really wish I had taken notes of every locked door, every unanswered mystery. I naively thought that the game would direct me back to these loose ends organically, but I was left to scratching my head on those missed opportunities. With the help of Google, I figured out that the entrances to these memories are rested with large withered trees early on in the game. I also learned that this was not an optional step. I needed to obtain an item called the Giant's Kinship in order to access the final boss fight. So off I went. It seemed like there were multiple memories I could access with the Ashen Mist Heart, but I decided to only pursue the mandatory one. The memory itself was rather mundane, just a timed level where I had to complete a boss fight to obtain the Giant's Kinship. Once I accomplished this, I gained access to the final boss. Guess where? Yeah, in the same room as the Throne Watcher and Defender. Honestly, as I'm writing this, I'm starting to feel infuriated. Like truly, how am I supposed to know without outside help that after I defeated the dual boss, I had to go run errands in order to come back to the exact same place, except now the boss just appeared out of thin air. I'm infuriated recalling this experience, but I was even angrier when I was actually playing the game. Unfortunately, this sour taste clouded my experience with the true final boss, Nashandra. The lore of Nashandra, in my opinion, is the most significant thing about her, way beyond the actual boss fight. She is the exact same person I met back in Drangleic Castle, except back then she was a beautiful woman sitting in a castle all by herself, appearing friendly. Here, in the Throne of Want, she assumed a demonic scythe-wielding form, inflicting curse upon the player. She wants to usurp the throne, claiming the power for herself. I love when an in-game character flips the script on me. The fact that I remembered her so vividly back at the castle because she was pristine and beautiful made this encounter that much more powerful. Regrettably, the actual boss fight was again lackluster. Nashandra has two types of attacks, her actual scythe and her dark magic. She also summons these sources that inflict quote-unquote curse status, which basically shrinks your max health. When the curse status bar started filling up, I panicked, thinking it would make the boss fight extremely difficult. But once I actually got cursed, it wasn't all that bad. With the correct healing window and plenty of life gems, Nashandra was a breeze. Defeating Nashandra brought me to the throne. A cutscene showed that I had walked up to an empty seat and claimed the throne for myself. The end. For an adventurous and fantastical journey in Drangleic, this ending felt abrupt and anticlimactic, for lack of a better word. If you're still here with me, thank you for listening to me ramble about a game I feel extremely frustrated by, but also am absolutely in love with. Now, some may say that this is a toxic relationship or that I may have Stockholm Syndrome with DS2 because FromSoft made it. I hear you. I mean, I've been complaining about this game for hours at this point. But I think I need to make one thing abundantly clear. I love Dark Souls 2, and it's a fun game. It's frustrating and even ridiculous at some points, but that doesn't hide the fact that I had the most fun playing it out of the entire Souls trilogy. Dark Souls 2 feels like an open world game, like Elden Ring. I talked about this a lot at various points of the game. A huge distinguishing factor that creates that open worldness is the player's sense of agency. Now, I know Dark Souls 1, at least the first half, also gets the reputation of being semi-open world, as you can technically walk anywhere on foot. However, I think there's a distinction between being open world versus feeling like open world. Right from the start after character creation, Dark Souls 2 puts a lot of agency in the player's hands. The tutorial section has many interwoven pathways filled with enemies. However, you don't have to complete all of them. You can read every tutorial message and practice against every enemy you see, or you can just skip all of that and head straight to Majula. Examples like these are all throughout the game. I've complained many times in this video that I got lost very easily. I think a huge factor that challenged my sense of direction was the amount of loose ends in every corner. After I finished the game, I went back to the wiki to see if I had missed anything, and I realized I had actually missed quite a few areas. Belfry Luna, Undead Purgatory, and even entire subsections like the Frigid Outskirts in the Crown of the Ivory King. But none of these things affected my mainline progression. These areas were optional, and now that I've experienced the mainline story, I can modulate my future gameplays however I like. And yes, I most definitely will go on to New Game Plus as well as fresh new playthroughs. I honestly did not anticipate myself wanting to replay DS2 since I'm mostly a one and done with all the other Souls titles. But Dark Souls 2 has a lot of features that encourage more thorough exploration that can only be experienced via a replay. In New Game Plus, on top of the usual enemies getting tankier and dealing more damage, there are also new enemy placements and loot drops. Features like the Pharros lockstone contraptions leave room for taking new risks, while items like life gems give me the opportunity to modulate the game's difficulty to my liking. Not to mention the weapon variety. I used a mace at the start of the game, then changed to a morning star, then a large club, and I even tried out the Drakekeeper's sword. There are hundreds more I haven't even looked at. I'm excited to continue playing DS2 because the replayability of this game is top-notch. Dark Souls 2 is a beautiful game, and that beauty goes beyond just superficial surface textures. Most of the areas have such distinct ecosystems and themes. The enemies, the greenery, the geography, and sometimes even minute details like the insects all complement each other to bring the environment alive. And paired with the right music, Dark Souls 2's world is fantastical and robust. So yes, the haters were right. Even though Dark Souls 2 is an ambitious game that took a lot of risks in pushing new features, it ultimately failed to follow through on a lot of its commitments. Enemies appear in gang squads, movement can feel clunky, there are too many bosses and too many of them are too similar. The list goes on. But the Glazers were also right. Dark Souls 2 is an intriguing, beautiful, and challenging game. And most of all, it embodies the adventurous spirit and journey into a magical, distant world. Simply put, it's just fun. Regardless, don't let anyone else's strong opinion influence yours. Well, maybe let me influence you just a little bit. Dark Souls 2 is peak.